Jay Heinrichs, welcome to Dad Saves America.
Thanks, John. It's a pleasure.
Well, this is a unique episode of Dad Saves America because we are in our studio together and yet doing it remotely because you are going to help us understand debate and discourse, and we've got an exciting project coming up later this year about that your voice is going to be an important part of. So you've written a book, Thank You for Arguing, that frankly, I took so many notes on that if I just went through my notes, we'd be talking for 3 hours. But I guess let's start real simple. What is rhetoric and how should we think about it? Because I think we're all accustomed to getting a lot of rhetoric, from politicians, from ourselves on social media. All of us are always mouthing off, myself being a big mouth. But how should I, what does rhetoric actually mean and why would you write a book about it?
Rhetoric, I'll give you the simplest answer. Rhetoric is the power of words. It's the way that words influence people. That's essentially what rhetoric is. Now, it's a dark art. The way some people influence people leads to bad things and people regretting the next morning. That being said, rhetoric at the same time was the common education of every one of the American founders. In fact, those principles are behind the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and our whole American system. Rhetoric inspired Shakespeare. In fact, he had to memorize more than 300 figures of speech when he was at the Stratford Grammar School. Western civilization is based on this idea that words don't just sit around looking pretty, that they have power. So that's what rhetoric is. It's a dark art, but it can be used for good.
What got you interested in looking at it in such a particular way? Because in some ways we take the use of our language and trying to be persuasive for granted. So why did you feel like you wanted to dive in and help, and actually make a case for it? Because your book makes a case for the value of rhetoric and of understanding how to make use of it.
Yeah, that's important to me. If I can go way back, I'm that old. That's way back. I would hang out in the library as a kid. I didn't do that well in school, grade-wise. I just read books in the library, and I'd pull them down at random and just, read good books, bad books, whatever, not knowing the difference, frankly. But all along, I wondered what words were doing, because I knew that even as a kid, I knew that soldiers sacrificed their lives for words, for what inspired them or what made them believe certain things. But all through school, I wondered, how do I study that power? Like, I'm learning vocabulary words, I'm learning storytelling, loved it all, learning poetry. But there was something else, and I didn't know what it was. I went to college and took every course I could that would teach me the power of words. Rhetoric wasn't taught. It was a very good college. Rhetoric wasn't taught there. I went to grad school briefly for a joint PhD in political science and English, realized academia and I wouldn't get along very well, dropped out, and went into journalism, where I thought maybe I could learn the power of words there. Years later, I'm working at Dartmouth College and bored in my job, spending long lunch hours, 2 hours, 3 hours, wandering these wonderful stacks in this university. And I came across a part of this library in the stacks where the fluorescent bulbs had been burned out. There were cobwebs on the books. And I thought, who's not reading these books and why? One of the books, actually two together, were bound in red leather. So I think that's why I pulled them down. I opened it up, and this book was signed by John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams had given a series of lectures when he was a 38-year-old senator at Harvard to first-year students as the first Boylston Chair of Rhetoric and Oratory. And in his first lecture, he told these boys, who turned out to be like 13 to 17, to catch from the relics of ancient oratory these unresisted powers which mold the mind of man to the will of the speaker and yield the guidance of the nation to the dominion of the voice. And I thought, that's it. So I read all his lectures, which essentially were a syllabus, a list of books I should be reading. For the next 20 years, I bothered rhetoricians and linguists and neurologists around the world and read all I could of Aristotle and Cicero and all the other people Mr. Adams told me to read. And that got me into it. Now, as I went, I realized how much rhetoric has to do with everything we believe to be Western civilization, the way decisions are made without violence, the way people can disagree. And I realized this was a discipline that had been taught right up through the 19th century and then basically abandoned. And I thought, this needs to be revived. What I didn't know is that revival had already begun. And my book, I'm glad to say, I was super lucky, got to help in that.
All right, here's your obligatory reminder to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell. It really actually does help us out a lot. When we're trying to book awesome new guests, they look at how many subscribers are on the channel and they say, yep, this is worth doing. And I want to bring the best possible people to you that I can. Speaking of which, let's get back to the conversation. Yeah, dive into that. So, it's strange that there's things that seem so important to the basic goals of being an educated person that seems to have dropped off in our education system. I think we have these massive gaps in the history our kids are taught. But rhetoric, the idea that you can command the language, that you can be persuasive, that you know how to speak well in front of others. I mean, of all the things in school, it seems like that's really practical. So what happened? Why did it fall away? And how do you know that? How do you know that that's not like a kind of nostalgia?
Well, I mean, it originally started dropping off late in the 19th century, even earlier than that, really. And it was mostly because people equated rhetoric with ancient Greek and Latin. So they thought it was the classics, sort of forgetting what rhetoric actually means. It means an ability to argue without anger, make common decisions, all that good stuff. More recently, so there were revivals over time, including in the 1970s, not anywhere I was. But then the very idea that you would be manipulating people through words, as Madison Avenue got started and was selling us junk food, rhetoric got the same bad reputation that, frankly, it had back in ancient Greece. I mean, the thing is, rhetoric is an art of manipulation. You are changing people's minds. You're changing their mood, making them more susceptible to persuasion. And you're also changing their willingness to act on something or to stop doing something. All of that can lead to all kinds of bad things, including expanding waistlines and voting for the wrong people and, fascist regimes and all that sort of thing through history. It's understandable that people thought maybe this is bad for kids. What was lost along the way is that rhetoric is the art of leadership. And teaching kids how to be leaders and what it takes to be one, getting people to like and trust you and want to follow you for all the right reasons, that got lost along the way. And I think it still needs to be pushed a little harder.
I got turned on to this phenomenon that's been happening in schools, and especially in high school, where the one area where rhetoric is still practiced and taught and actually a kind of battleground is high school debate, the debate clubs. And it sure seems like there's been elements that have crept into that club and that art form, if you will, that have gotten a little off track, at least as far as if you believe that the point of a debate is to take two different sides and may the best argument win. Identity politics and stuff have started to creep in. But I guess how do you think about the role of debate in like grappling with the truth? Because there is this weird thing where when you're trying to win an argument, you often find yourself not really making friends. Very few of us do that. So help me understand like where debate fits into like the pursuit of truth.
Well, so there are really two kinds of serious conversations that lead to good things. One is that the kind of argument or discussion that leads to some sort of truth, and that's a kind of philosophical argument. That's not necessarily rhetoric. In fact, most scholars throughout the ages have separated the philosophical debate from the rhetorical debate. The
Hmm.
difference being rhetoric leads to choices. Deliberative rhetoric, as Aristotle put it, leads to choices and decisions. What are we going to do next as a society or a family, for that matter? What college should I go to? Should I go to college at all? Let's argue about that and come up with a decision. That's not necessarily arguing over what's the nature of the good life, the classic philosophical conversations. Two different things, both very important. Now, when you talk about high school debate, that's great mind training. But it's the equivalent of learning algebra in order to become an engineer. It's essential, important skill, but it's not going to teach you how to put up buildings. The same way that debate is good preparation, training the mind, but it's not necessarily teaching you how to lead people and get them to make decisions in common without wanting to kill each other.
The the one thing that has definitely felt like it's happened in I'm 47, and certainly in my lifetime, is it seems like what's the right way to put this? The quality of our public rhetoric has deteriorated. It seems like that. It seems like we've gone to a place that is unrecognizable from not that long ago. If you look at, like, for example, presidential debates, just in the 1980s, or heck, even in the early 2000s, there was a decorum that seems to have evaporated on all sides. And it's like, I think everybody wants to point fingers at their political opponents and say, you guys made it worse. But how do you think about what's happened to rhetoric in our public discourse in the country?
Well, we've slid a long way from the Lincoln-Douglas debates, where you had candidates get up and speak for more than an hour at a time. Before Lincoln gave his Gettysburg Address, a different guy, a Massachusetts senator, got up and spoke for 3 hours, and he was boffo. It was the equivalent of a blockbuster movie to these people because he led them through the entire battle. It was very exciting. Plus, the guy managed to stand there for 3 hours without going to the bathroom. That guy was a champion. These days now, what slid even further, and I think, just to back up a little bit, during the 1980s, 90s, even the early 2000s, the level of debate was actually higher than I think people thought it was. There was a lot of really good argument going on that led to genuine bipartisan decisions of all kinds, some of which we regret, but there was a kind of consensus that was established through debate. What happened in the meantime, I don't have to tell you this, John, is social media. Now, social media is based on attention, not necessarily following people for honorable reasons. It's simply attention. And however you can get that attention is going to win you votes as well as money. So what that does is tribal rhetoric, which is what Aristotle called demonstrative rhetoric, which is um, rhetoric that gets attention, essentially, and talks about values and who's good and who's bad, who's on our side, who's on the other side. That's what took over political debate, because social media took over political debate. And social media is a tribal medium.
What It's almost hard to think about the world before this, and for our kids, they're growing up in this environment. Especially now we're sort of getting into, like, the tail end of a generation, Gen Z, that was born entirely into a world with screens and internet connectivity. At the same time, we have shows like this, long form conversational experiences where you do get more length, more depth, or at least the opportunity for more depth. um, do you think that rhetoric's making a comeback in this environment, or are we still sort of in hell?
Well, thank God for podcasts. You're doing the Lord's work here, man. This is every now and then, and I'm no historian, But I think I've noticed throughout the ages, there have been certain media that sort of pop up to serve a need among a very specific group of people. And you can call them elites or highly educated people or people with just a deep curiosity. But you can see that throughout the ages, there were special newspapers that turned into some of the first magazines, that turned into magazines like the Atlantic Monthly, that published some of the greatest literature of the time for a very specific audience. And I'm seeing podcasts do that increasingly. And I notice that you can see a pattern among podcast audiences. And now I'm in your wheelhouse here, and I won't go too far into that. But I do notice there's a certain kind of audience that has a need that's being served by podcasts. Now, does that in turn improve the debate, the national debate? Will politicians start trying to serve that audience? It will only happen if that audience gets big enough, and it clearly is not yet. That being said, there is a need for people who will seriously discuss things and earnestly try to disagree in some fruitful way. That doesn't lead to bad things. And that's what saves civilization every time it tried to collapse throughout history. So thank God for podcasts.
Yeah, 2024 has been called the podcast election, in that, you had a pretty big difference between the path Donald Trump ended up taking, going on a lot of these long form shows, and a much more tightly controlled path that Kamala Harris took. So it does seem like there's been like a tipping point has been reached in the level of like the amount of people that are actually engaging in multi-hour conversations.
Yeah, not only that, but the idiots among consultants, political consultants, pardon my language, are still paying for television advertising, and it's dead. I mean, in the next election, television advertising will not begin to win elections. It hasn't for years. And so it'll be interesting to see the shift now in politics of where not just the money, but the power goes in terms of influencing people. Now, clearly, social media is going to continue to be extremely important. But I'm seeing even in social media, I mean, I have to use TikTok to sell my latest book, and it's painful. But at the same time, I'm getting to do more and more long conversations than I did when I published my first rhetoric book back in 2007. I'm having far more interesting conversations like this one than I did back then.
So let's dive in, because one of the things that I was excited to just have you on and talk through your book and your work is, I do feel like this is a skill that has two components to it for our kids. One is being good at it for a whole host of reasons, to help get a job, to be able to like lead a group or understand how to navigate the workplace, be a good salesperson. But the other piece is to be savvier about the world that we consume. We get hit with all these messages. We see what is often like earnest seeming, authentic seeming arguments getting made. And how do you evaluate them? How do you have a sense of whether there's something good here, or whether it's being argued in bad faith, or using sort of tricks to kind of hack my psychology? So let's like, what's a good place to start to understand what the dark arts of rhetoric are all about?
Well, maybe we can start with how to inoculate a kid against manipulation. That may be one way to delve into the dark art.
Yeah, I think that's good, because I mean, our kids are hit with a lot of messaging.
Yeah. So one of the things that kids do learn in classes that involve rhetoric, including in high schools, AP English language courses teach a big dose of rhetoric now. And I'm glad to say they use Thank You for Arguing as a textbook. So I love these teachers. But one of the most important principles for inoculating kids against the evil manipulation is this term called exigence. And exigence has to do with what the intent of the arguer is, or the manipulator, or politician, or advertiser, or whatever. What are they trying to get? Now, Marcus Tullius Cicero, who according to himself was the greatest orator of all time, asked the question in Latin, cui bono, who benefits? What he's really talking about is exigence. And so when you look at the way exigence works, you have to think, okay, what is the need or the problem this person is trying to either satisfy or resolve? So if somebody is trying to tell you that immigrants are a huge problem in America, the first thing to ask, if you're looking for authenticity or whether you want to trust the speaker, is what does this person want? Why is this person saying this? What is his or her need? What are they trying to accomplish by telling me this? Now, are they very concerned about crime in a particular area? Are they trying to set a certain policy? Where is the policy? Why am I not hearing it? Is the policy really going to solve that problem? It leads you down this path of logic that you might not do otherwise. Now, instead of worrying about, is this person real? Is this person evil or good? Is this person on my side or some other side? You don't have to worry so much about that. Simply say, who's benefiting from this argument? And how is this person personally going to benefit? Now, if you can judge that well, and that is a skill. That's not easy to learn. But if you're focused on that, you're going to be focusing on the proper parts of the argument that allow you to think objectively. The second, I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
No, keep going.
So the second thing to think about are what specific tools are this person using? So there are the tools of ethos, which has to do with getting somebody to like and trust you. And if you want, I'll tell you just real quick 3 tools. I'm sure you know them,
Please.
actually. One is, I call them craft, caring, and cause. So craft has to do with making your audience believe that you know what you're doing, that you have a solution to the particular problem you're talking about, that you have maybe the book learning, but also the experience. Like you don't want a surgeon right out of med school to take out your appendix. You want to know how many appendices that person is. That's craft. Okay. Caring has to do with whether you're disinterested, whether you're interested only in what your audience wants. Disinterest is interesting because we've forgotten the term to the point where we elect highly interested politicians. In other words, people who want to benefit by being politicians instead of serving the people. Now, so a disinterested person would be like Mother Teresa, selfless. All right, then there's cause, which Aristotle said is the most powerful of all. In Greek, it's called arete. A lot of Christians know the term. And arete or cause has to do with what's your higher purpose. And you'll see this with corporations saying, we're not just selling you widgets, we're making the world a better place. So caring, craft, and cause is a way to evaluate the politician. Like, how does that balance out? Now, what is the politician saying that may not be trustworthy, that doesn't fit this? Like, okay, disinterest being pretty powerful. Like, is this person out for his own self, or is he really serving my needs? And a salesperson will say that, I know just what you need. I have this at home myself and I love it. Okay, you know, if you understand rhetoric enough, that you can be a little skeptical of that. Craft really has to do with, does that surgeon really have that experience? Easy to find out. And cause is more difficult to find out. Does this person share my values? And does that person also live up to those values? All right, that's just ethos. That's one set of rhetorical tools. Then we could, if you wanted to, not too long, get into logos and pathos. Logos has to do with the words, but also the logic. And I spent a lot of time, especially my latest book, talking about the difference between deductive and inductive logic, which is the most boring thing to teach, but highly important. And then pathos is relatively easy. It has to do with reading the emotions in the room and responding to those emotions, and preferably changing them to the point where you put the audience into the state of cognitive ease, as the moderns say, which is this persuadable state. Aristotle called it receptivity. All right, all those things, ethos, pathos, and logos, have to do with reading your audience, speaking a language that moves them, changing their mood, getting them their opinions to shift, not necessarily to change altogether, but to the point where you can have a real conversation. That alone is influence. And then most important of all, build a relationship. That's what ethos is about. So with a lot of arguments, a lot of people, especially everyone who comes with a Y chromosome, first of all, have trouble shutting up and listening. I'm one of them, clearly. But also, guys want to win arguments. They want to win on points. And really, one of the greatest wins is to come out of a situation with a closer relationship. And that applies to business leaders, politicians, and marriages for that matter.
One of the things that I think about a lot is how hard it is to get to do two things. One, to be persuasive. If you really care about something and you believe you're in the right, but that the body politic or your friends and neighbors are on the other side. So trying to be persuasive on something that people care about when they hold the opposing view is, it's really important and it's really difficult. And then the second is sort of in a way related to that is, how do you know you're not captured by your own biases, your own desire to be right, your own emotions or your ego, your identity? This notion that when you talk about being disinterested, it's a very interesting idea that there's credibility in not having skin in the game. Because in a lot of ways, it's like, we get hit with the opposite often. Like, I care about this issue because it affects me, it affected me. So we kind of get this from both sides. So let's sort of start with this question of disinterest and being persuasive. Help me work through this and help the viewer, the listener, understand like the terrain here.
Well, you should use that word terrain. I hope we can get back to that because the Greeks were all about terrain. I can explain later. In the meantime, my wife tells me I'm at my worst when I'm right. And, so that's where when you get passionate about something, all you want to do is just push that opinion into the other person. But there's another really important rhetorical concept that's so important that the Greeks came up with a god behind this thing. And the god and the concept is called kairos, which is a different way of looking at time. Kairos is the art of opportunity. So you have chronos, where the clock just keeps turning and life goes on and then you die. Kairos is how you can turn the clock back or go into the interstices of time to choose exactly the right moment to do the right thing. So the Greeks were all about the kairos of debate, meaning, is this a good time actually to have this argument? Are people in the right state? You'll notice when you read the Greek classics, the dialogues in Plato in particular, but also in Cicero, they're drinking a lot of wine. They're not, clearly the debate hasn't started until they've had a flagon or two or whatever they drank. And the reason for that is that they were waiting for the right moment to start. And there's lots of stuff in the literature that shows that they just would shut things down if this wasn't the right time. You hear it all the time. In fact, the orator named Ecclesiastes in the Bible, the one who said, there's a time for this, there's a time for that, there's a time for everything. Yeah. Ecclesiastes actually means assemblyman or orator. Ecclesiastes was a rhetorician, a teacher of rhetoric, who was teaching the art of kairos. Now, getting back to this whole idea of disinterest, why do I even mention that? A lot of times what we think is in our own interest is based on emotion more than our deepest identity or our deepest needs. And at the same time, logic flies out the window at the wrong times. So being able, where people are sort of breathing easily and, in a good mood, Aristotle wrote a lot about the importance of that. That's kairos. So the other thing is, the second thing about kairos is, what is the situation? So one of the biggest mistakes that people make when they are arguing with someone, especially if they're arguing selfishly, I'm right and you're wrong, is they're not using enough peripheral vision. In other words, who else is listening in? On social media, it could be a lot of people. The person you're arguing with is probably the least persuadable person. The people who are listening in, the onlookers, may be more persuadable. And I use the example of Thanksgiving dinner, where there's always the crazy uncle. I'm one, by the way, and love playing that role. But there's always that uncle with the opinions that drives everybody crazy, and everybody kind of stiffens up, and all of a sudden people are starting to get up and help with the dessert or whatever. You don't want to be the person who just argues directly with that person unless you're thinking, okay, how am I going to be the grown-up in the room? How am I going to improve my ethos in this room? Am I able to express an opinion in such a way that I might sway my niece over there or, my parents or whatever they are? The person I'm talking to, that uncle, he's not going to change his opinion. And so that's part of Kairos. That's part of the situational thinking. Who's your audience?
I saw this interview recently. It was a man. He was English. I think personally had some success, but was arguing for a very, let's just say, fairly progressive economic agenda, something that would involve a lot of redistribution. And he kept coming back in his rhetoric to this claim that, well, like, what I want to see happen will make me worse off. But it's the right thing. Even though, and he said it over and over, there was a lot of repetition. What was going on there? Because that argument, it struck me, and I saw this while I was, making my way through your book, and I was like, oh wow, that's really, he is playing the disinterest card like a weapon to just keep coming back. And he pushed it on the two other people in the conversation because they were, he's like, we're all successful. Look, hey, if you wanna keep hoarding your wealth, great, but I'm willing to make the sacrifice. This is one style of argument. Help me understand what he's doing. What's going on there? Why does it work or not work?
Well, the problem I'm hearing from you, and of course I'm only hearing it from you, I didn't hear this argument, is he's only using one tool. So, I mean, good for you. You've established your disinterest. Now, tell me what good is what you're proposing for the audience. And, is this guy able to reach out to the audience saying, okay, if there is this redistribution of wealth, we will expand the middle class. And when that happens, our social divisions go away. Or you can say, we have a homeless problem. We have a violence problem. All kinds of things are happening. If you look at the curves and economically, you can see that a lot of this happened when social inequality took off. The lines line up. Here's specifically what I think should be done, and none of the people who are listening right now are going to be hurt by it. In fact, that America will be so much better, more powerful. Now use the vision. One of the problems I see in politics in general these days, and I think that actually Trump is one of the few people who understand this. I don't think most people are that ideological. I don't think people are that much on the left and the right. They want to see a vector of some sort. They want to see a mental arrow that leads us someplace. So if you look at why did this guy Mamdani win the primary in New York, winning districts that voted for Trump? Why would people who voted for Trump vote for that guy, a democratic socialist? Well, I think a good rhetorical explanation of that is that anyone who is talking about the future is using deliberative rhetoric. And that's like dessert in politics. That's the sweetest thing people will hear. It's so refreshing because so many people are talking tribally, good, bad, including Trump doing it too much. But also, if you look at Mamdani, he was making huge hyperbolic promises that people don't believe he'll ever meet. The buses aren't going to be free and faster, but maybe they'll be cheaper and a little faster, and people will be thrilled with that. Maybe he will freeze the rent not for 2 million people, but 200,000. Good progress, heading in the right direction. Same with Trump. He makes these wild promises, and if he's able to move the needle a little bit, people love it. Now, so you start with disinterest. Here's, I'm serving you. I'm actually suffering from what I'm proposing. Great. But now you've really got to turn into the interest part, which is your audience. You have to say what Aristotle called what is advantageous for your audience. What's their advantage? First you say, this is not to my advantage, but then you have to switch and say, here's yours.
Yeah, I remember you talking about in the book the sort of the three tenses and where they get used. Let's dig into that. So the past, the present, and the future. So you just touched on the role of the future, but let's go back. In rhetoric, in making arguments, when do you want to look backwards and kind of what is the maximum value of that?
Well, so Aristotle defined these things, which I think is just brilliant because it works in every way. The past tense is dedicated to what Aristotle called forensic rhetoric. It has to do with crime and punishment, what happened in the past. Either in a corporate sense, that didn't work, and the jerks, who were behind it should have been fired. That's crime and punishment. Forensics, in other words. Demonstrative rhetoric is the present, and that has to do with values. What's good and what's bad. It's often called sermonic rhetoric because it's the rhetoric of sermons. Here's how we should behave. Here's what happens when we don't. That's sermonic rhetoric. But it can also lead to tribalism because there are good people and bad people. There are people who share our values and people who don't, and those are evil. Aristotle's favorite kind of rhetoric that he thought was the rhetoric of politics, or should be, is deliberative rhetoric that has to do with choices that affect the future. I could give you an example of this that I wrote about in my book. When my son George was 15, I was standing. We live in New Hampshire, very cold in the wintertime. It was a winter day. I was in the bathroom, wearing nothing but a towel, and I found that the toothpaste tube had been squeezed dry. And so, knowing who the likely culprit was, being the father of a 15-year-old son, I shout through the closed door, "George, you used up all the toothpaste." And I hear this sarcastic voice on the other side saying, "That's not the point, is it, Dad? The point is, how are we going to keep this from happening again?" Now, he was teasing me because I'd been lecturing at the dinner table without any appearance of his paying attention for years. And one of the things I said was, you want to get yourself out of trouble, switch the tense to the future and see what happens. It actually can work because you're talking about solving problems for all time. Now, I've done this with corporate consultants, and I can tell you it's great when a corporation screws up. Like, admit the fault, say how it violated your high standards, which you intently live up to, and then talk about the fix. Immediately switch to the future where life will be better for all time. Now, George was teasing me, and he also knew I'm the bad kind of parent who, if you can make me laugh, you can get away with murder. And he knew that. So I did. I mean, I didn't punish him or anything, the other thing I didn't do was to lecture him and tell him what a good son would do. George, a good son would pay attention and, have the responsibility to, that would lead only to defensiveness. And if you see that kind of demonstrative rhetoric, that values rhetoric used in politics or in personal relations, it almost always goes bad. If you tell somebody what good behavior would be, they're not gonna want to listen to you, and they'll be defensive. On the other hand, I told George he won the argument, which, for a 15-year-old son with a Y chromosome, I mean, he needed it. And I asked him to go down to the basement and get a tube of toothpaste, and he happily did. So I consider that a triumph of persuasion on my part. Letting him win on points, I won the argument in terms of toothpaste.
That points to this concept of concession that I want to spend some time on, but coming back to this tense issue and tactic, you're touching on something here that, again, such a big goal to me for this conversation is to just have people hear the tactics here, because that switch that you're describing, man, I feel like we hear it in political rhetoric all the time. I'm more of a right of center guy, but at the end of the day, the political labels end up bogging down. But I'm going to bring up a recent events, which is the LA fires. And Gavin Newsom is very good with rhetoric. And you watch him and how he there's a decade of forest management problems in California, and similarly of homelessness problems in California, both of which have gotten worse over time. And Gavin Newsom's been in power for a long time.
Yeah.
And when you're watching him, he will shift he will make it seem almost like it's trivial, or that it's like the low road to look back and say, well, why didn't this work? Why didn't your promises lead to, why wasn't the reservoir filled with water when they needed it most? Isn't this he's like, the real question is, what are we going to do now? How are we going to make sure this never happens again? How are we going to rebuild the Palisades in a way that's, more equitable, or whatever rhetoric? But he's a really good example of this bridging to the future. Are there other ways that we as citizens should be on guard for this? Because it does seem often like it's an evasion tactic, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Well, not only that it has the danger, especially someone like Gavin Newsom, who's a little too articulate, that he comes across as being slick. And that's a very slick kind of tool to use. I mean, people, I think, can spot it. The other thing that happens is there is a role for forensic rhetoric. Like, why did this happen? And, before you can fix something. So, for example, you talk about homelessness. I mean, the fact that it's almost impossible to get anything built in the Bay Area kind of proves that there needs to be an investigation of exactly how these, and of course, the investigations have been done. It's just that someone like Newsom isn't going to mention it. But showing a deep understanding of why you can't build anything in the Bay Area is really important to talk about what the solutions might be. Because the problem is, if you switch too rapidly to the future, you're bound to come up with some pretty shallow answers. The forensics are important, and also an understanding of what your shared values are is equally important. I go to Seattle a lot, and the homeless problem there is right and on every sidewalk.
Yeah.
And the fact that you have multi-billionaires living there shows to me that there's not a shared sense of values in that town. Like, what are we a city for? What are we supposed to be doing here? Now, it's really clear you need elevators, you need tall buildings, you need to build places where people don't want to build. I mean, homelessness exists for a number of reasons, but one obvious one is that there aren't enough homes. Now, why? What caused that? That's forensics. Now, you are going to blame some people. There are going to be some criminals there, and there's going to be some talk in the present tense about values. Like, what do we want? Why are we a city? Why do we live here? Why don't we live somewhere else? Those are important questions that are all those three tenses together. Switching too fast to the future makes you sound like George with the toothpaste. And he was trivializing a serious toothpaste situation here.
So if I'm a young person or I'm getting out into my career, help me think about how I might make use of this, the different way that the past, present, and future can get used to my advantage. So I'm like, if I'm in a job interview, for example, how might I make use of these tenses to help advance my case for being hired?
First, understand what kairos is. Hugely important, because that has to do with the tense, especially the future tense. So one of the things, I used to be a manager, and when I would manage people who would manage people. So I would tell my managers, my direct reports, that when they hired someone, they should hire someone who will be the best a year from now. Don't hire the person who's best now. Why? Because those people are going to grow. They're not maxing out their careers. They're not going to be bored in the job. And they're going to be learning a ton from you. So they're going to follow what you want a lot more closely. Okay, so you're the job seeker. When you go in, you want to say that. You want to say, you want to hire me because I'm going to be the best a year from now. Now, the great thing about that is not only are you switching to the future, trying to get the employer possibly to ignore those blank parts of your resume or the fact that you don't have direct experience leading to that job. What it does, instead of just saying, I'm a good learner, which is the standard thing to do, you're implying that in a much more powerful way by envisioning a future and describing that. Okay, because a year from now, here's what I'm going to be able to do. Because I've proven my ability to get this far. I'm going to get that far a year from now. Now, I know you're looking at people who are probably the perfect resumes for the job. A year from now, they're not going to be the best. Now, that is one way to switch to the future. The other thing to keep in mind, though, is at the very end of any job interview, you want to apply a little pathos. And I like to say, Cicero taught me this with his orations, that you want to save the emotion to the end. So at the end, when the person says, do you have any more questions or whatever, you can say, I just want to tell you, I am made for this job. I'm really passionate about this place. Explain why, to show that you actually know the place. But then say, my values match yours. You need to say it in a way that sort of matches their language. But basically, that's what you're saying. I'm a right fit for this place culturally, or, I fit in. That's arete. That's expressing your cause. My cause is your cause. When you do that, you're adding pathos, but you're also putting it in the context of the future. Because this is the kind of passionate person who a year from now will be a leader. That's what you hope to convey.
That's great advice. There is a book, I think by Daniel Pink, called When. And there was a chapter in it about endings. And I found this to be, especially as a filmmaker, because that's part of my background, is directing documentaries and commercials. That your ending matters a lot. That your ending is your takeaway, and so since we're on the subject of timing and when is the appropriate time to deliver what kind of message, does that resonate with your understanding of sort of like rhetorical skill, tactics, being persuasive? Like, why do endings matter the way they do?
Oh, I love that. Well, so the Greeks came up with the term peroration, which is the passionate ending to a speech. Now, I'm getting in the rhetorical weeds here, so you have to excuse me for this. I'm blaming you. It was a great question. They also invented something called periodos, or the period as we know it. And that's our little dot at the end of a sentence. But actually, the original period that the Greeks came up with was a passage of about 40 words, which was the length of a single human breath, expressed by a trained orator, speaking loudly to a group of 3,000 people down in the hoi polloi down below. Now, I did some research on this, and I looked up a number of modern speeches and debates and things like that. And then I went to movie speeches, where it's a lot easier to find out where the peroration is, because that's when the music swells up and the camera switches to the audience and their tears. So I timed speeches, and I found an absolute consistency in the climax of speeches, 12 to 13 seconds, 40 words. So I actually tell people, if they're giving a talk, it doesn't matter what, write 40 words before you do anything else, and rewrite them 20, 30 times until they're perfect. Memorize those 40 words, then write the rest of the speech, because they're going to remember those 40 words, those 12 to 13 seconds. And if you deliver them well, you're going to wow anybody. Now, in a job interview, you kind of can do the same thing. 12 seconds isn't that long. And during your peroration at the end, and this is the end of anything, really, including asking someone to marry you. I didn't do it this way. I was drunk at the time, but that's a different story. At the end of any kind of story, for that matter, if you want to end with a bang, think of a period. Which, by the way, the reason they came up with this is the Greeks had a theory that a lot of neurology has confirmed, which is that the patterns of the mind and the way ideas are absorbed are deeply associated with the patterns of the body. So the idea that people would absorb a single thought in 12 to 13 seconds, in modern education theory, it's 10 seconds. Maybe our attention span is shorter, but I don't think so. Those 12 to 13 seconds are equated with the human breath because that's how we learn to speak and absorb each other's thoughts.
That makes a lot of sense because the human speech patterns are necessarily breath based. We're talking until we run out of gas. We pause to take a deep breath. That's really interesting. That's a good tip. See, this is the thing. There's I knew you were going to be you're going to have a lot of good tips. So you've got this direction to the future. You've got you mentioned something with Gavin Newsom that I also think is really interesting and important, and seems like it's become more important recently, which is polish. So, you'd sort of off the cuff said, the problem, one of the problems with Gavin Newsom is he's, sort of too slick. Now, I had Vivek Ramaswamy on the show, and I think he falls in the same category. He speaks without skipping a beat, and it's off-putting. And you write about this in the book. So, keeping in our political sort of domain for a minute, Donald Trump's the opposite. He'll go off on random weird tangents, and he'll repeat himself, and even George W. Bush, who I think you do also reference in the book, the sort of folksy, almost not the smartest, not the brightest bulb in the set sound ends up being more appealing. What's going on there? Why do we seem to be a little hardwired to be skeptical of the slick talker?
Yeah, that's such a great question. The Greeks wrote about this all the time. There was one Greek who said, to be less eloquent would be more eloquent. In other words, and just to be even nerdier, when Abraham Lincoln really got established, it was through one speech, the Cooper Union Address, where he was talking to a bunch of rich snobs in New York City. And here he was, this hick from Kentucky. Now, he's a corporate lawyer. He just didn't sound like that. And they didn't know him from Adam. So here he comes, this dark horse candidate for president. And when he got there, he had this notoriously high nasal voice and this horrible accent for a New Yorker. And when he began to speak, he was hesitant. He looked extremely nervous. He apparently was sweating profusely. He probably really was nervous. And then slowly he began to build and got more and more confident sounding. And the New Yorkers had such low expectations of this guy that he helped set. And that is a tool called aporia, which literally means something like ignorance, meaning, I'm not as smart as you. I'm not as educated. I'm nervous here. I'm not like a bunch of you swells out there. But it makes people, if done right, and apparently he did it right, it makes people kind of sympathize with you. But more important than that, and just getting back to Trump, who I don't think anybody feels sorry for. He's not the kind of guy you feel sorry for. I think he's showing what people believe to be authenticity. That this idea that this is me, take it or leave it. This is who I am. I'm not acting. Now, there's another term. I'm throwing out all the terms I can since you praised me. It's a term called actio. It's a Latin term that means both acting, as in performing, on a stage, but it also means action. So the action of delivering an address that actually moves people and takes them to a different place and makes them do something differently or vote for somebody, that's an action that's done by a kind of performance. And there's always a kind of contradiction between the two, because you are trying to achieve a very specific purpose. To do that, you're playing a certain role. If that role doesn't match that purpose exactly, you could get in trouble. So suppose you are somebody like a Gavin Newsom. I don't want to pick on him. and I'm to the left of center, by the way. When he gets up on a stage and he's talking about the LA fires and how to fix things, the problem is he should be sounding like a fixer. He shouldn't be looking like he's enjoying himself so much. There needs to be a little
Right.
bit of aporia in there, this idea that, okay, this is who I am. I'm just telling it like it is. And if you don't like my performance, too bad. Just listen to my words.
Yeah, is there more to the story on this question of likability and sort of not being so slick? Is there neuroscience behind this, or what? Because it's a really interesting. It does seem like we're in the age of the intense desire for authenticity in a way that is different. Like when you look back at our past sort of leaders, they sure seemed like they were. It was more common, and we were more comfortable with like elevated speech from politicians, and even like the as we sit here in 2025, when you watch a news broadcast and the news anchors have this affect, this sort of sing-songiness that's very fake.
Yeah.
And it's like, why are we doing this still? Like, there's a part of it that just seems totally bizarre. But it emerged for a reason. So has something changed? Like what in like the nature of our ears from your perspective? Like what's happening?
Well, that's a complicated question. I'm not sure I have all the answers to it. I'm no neurologist, but I do know that a lot of research has been done about trust and what people think, how the brain works when people perceive a stranger. So, a lot of
Yeah.
research has been done on oxytocin, which has been wrongly called the love drug, because if you administer oxytocin to a person, they're going to feel such love for the people they're with and the people they know and their friends. It's going to be awesome. And then the moment a stranger walks in the room, they want to kill them. Like there's all kinds of like their amygdala just fires up, fight or flight. And if
Oh, really? That's
yeah, so
interesting.
what's
I didn't
interesting,
realize that part of it.
yeah, and
Yeah.
tests on young mothers, new mothers in the hospital holding their babies, their oxytocin levels are going to be, of course, very high, right? There's a love
Yeah.
drug, my love for my
Yeah.
baby, right?
Yeah.
You
The
see
bonding hormone is another description
bonding
I've heard.
hormone. Bonding, though, works in a defensive role too, because you see
Yeah.
Mama Grizzly the moment a strange man walks through that door. And this has been measured. There have been tests on this. So all of us, and by the way, the oxytocin levels in a mother who sees the stranger through the roof. The oxytocin levels go up. Now, I think this gets back to this idea of the importance of authenticity and that kind of rawness that can convey authenticity. Basically, what you're trying to do is to establish a relationship in a real hurry with people who may not be physically present with you, which is why Zoom is so weird.
Yeah.
How
Yeah.
and you are seeing now different techniques and ways of address for people, and I think you're going to see a kind of expression, or how am I going to put a tone that people use. It's going to be like broadcaster tones, only different for virtual chats. Because I think we need to have a way to convey trust in a way that the medium doesn't allow physically. You have to change your tone. Now, why do journalists or newscasters speak this way on television? I think it originally conveyed a sense of objectivity. That, instead of saying every night, I don't have a dog in this hunt, you have this kind of tone that conveys a complete lack of emotion.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, I think there's that makes a lot of sense because it is a tone that is so consistent that the anchor can almost be swapped out. Like they're all doing the exact same cadence. It's like trying to become almost invisible in a way. If you're Peter Jennings, you don't sound that different from Lester Holt
Yeah.
because you're basically just doing this job and not meant to bring your person to it.
Well, and there can be a real power to that. And that gets back to disinterest, this appearance of disinterest, because objectivity is disinterest, essentially. It's saying, this isn't about me, this is about the news. All the facts fit the print or broadcast. And you look at Walter Cronkite, the moment he came out against the Vietnam War, it was explosive. I mean, oh my gosh, that's the way it is, that. And in fact, I think a lot of newscasters were just imitating Walter Cronkite, because why not? But when he actually expressed a strong opinion, that man had so much trust among Americans that I think he did more to turn people's opinions toward that war, against the war, than any single person.
One of the things that has happened in measurable ways, um, for all of our institutions, which is this term that's this shorthand that is interesting and weird unto itself. But when I say institutions, I mean the government, academia, the media. In your book, you take swipes at academia that warmed my heart. But one of the things that has happened is trust in these things has really collapsed. Now, the trust in the government first began to collapse in the aftermath of the Vietnam War and Watergate. Those were big moments. But we stand now in a moment where trust along every dimension virtually you can measure is at serious lows. And then on top of that, we have this technology and artificial intelligence that really sets us up to need to be even more skeptical of what we see and hear. How do you think about this change in trust in the society as a writer and as someone concerned with rhetoric, and with rhetoric being a tool for good?
Well, your questions are getting harder and harder, John. And I'm still working out the AI problem. In fact, I have almost a year before I have to deliver a talk in Helsinki to the European Speechwriters Conference on keeping the soul in the age of AI. Like, what are these speechwriters going to do? I hope I come up with something, frankly, because I'm not quite there yet. I do think, though, that our trust in institutions and a need to fix that is a little bit different from our difficulty that we're having trusting what we see online or in the media.
For sure, there's sort of I smuggled two different categories of question in there. So let's steep on the first, on the collapse in trust in the media, academia, politics, and to some extent each other more broadly. Although I think that's on firmer ground at the local level than people realize.
Yeah, yeah. Well, good. That's a good point. Well, let me play Gavin Newsom here, as like immediately switch the future. How are we going to solve this problem? How do you solve it? And I, obviously, I do have a dog in this hunt. I'm going to bring up rhetoric again, because I truly believe that when the norms collapse, when we don't share them, when we become entirely tribal, when we don't trust anybody in government, when academia seems to have a bias, and when a lot of people in academia don't even seem to be aware of that bias, that causes a collapse in trust of all kinds. And the corporate world, if you look at how much Silicon Valley was pretty much worshipped just 10, 15 years ago, and how now the trust in Silicon Valley has gone through the basement.
Oh yeah.
How do you rebuild trust in not just individual institutions, but as a whole? Going back to rhetoric, I think we need to know that craft, carrying, cause is the basis for trust. That is a philosophical principle, not just a rhetorical one. So you have to say in every institution, okay, does the government know what it's doing? What would it take for the government to know what it's doing? Now, there's been a collapse in trust of expertise. So
Yes.
whatever your values or opinion are, that's how you get hired in government and, frankly, in academia to a large degree for opposite reasons. Now, to rebuild that, you have to say, okay, what would Aristotle say? He'd say, where's the phronesis here? Where is the craft, the practical wisdom, as it's translated? Do these people know what they're doing in academia? Are they solving a particular problem that we need to have solved? Now, research universities are in big trouble for a lot of the wrong reasons, I believe, because I work with research universities as a consultant, and I can tell you they do amazing things, and our nation depends on their work. And yet, this whole fear of wokeness is bleeding over into people who are the most unwoke people you'll ever meet. They're all suffering from this. Okay, looking at craft, what is it that research universities and universities in general should be doing? What should they be teaching kids? Government. What are the real problems here? Not the problems that cause feelings or bring attention on social media. All right, then caring. Cui bono? Who's benefiting from what they're trying to achieve? Who's making money from this stuff and why? And is their money going in the wrong directions? Is this money there in the corporate world, particularly in any network effect institution like social media? There's, if I can use a bad word here, there's
Sure.
this term intuitification that everybody's using.
Oh yeah, so you start off and everything's great, and the next thing you know, there's 45,000 ads, and it's absolutely insufferable.
Right, and they're still making money. What they're doing is they're basically bleeding whatever trust there was that paid for them in the first place dry. How do you fix that? Well, again, you're looking at disinterest and valuing it. And to the point where maybe when people use the word disinterest, they don't mean uninterest. I mean, just something as basic as the meaning of that term. Then finally, the values. Let's look really closely at the values Americans truly share. And again, just getting back to, I honestly believe that we're not as divided as we think we are. We're divided by social media. We're told to be divided. You know, you lean to the right, I lean to the left. Does that really matter? I bet we would agree on most things. Like we should build more. We should, the deficit is a bad idea. We could have a long line of things we agree on and basically come down to the fact that we both love this country, I imagine. We both believe in capitalism, as almost every American truly does, including democratic socialists. And, we are able to share things a lot more. Now, what we are interested in then is that future tense. Okay, are we going to lead to a place that isn't just getting people attention, but is solving real problems? Caring, craft, and cause is a great way to start. The ethos at characteristics, where we're judging people by, who they are and what they're saying and how they benefit. All that, I think, is a way to sort of analyze trust, to know how we're going to trust people. Then we could talk about AI.
Well, let's stay on this on the rhetorical side of this, because the AI question is a whole nother conversation. It's just one more, but it is one more trust vector that's challenging. I think there's a pretty decent body of work that of survey work and otherwise that would line up with what you're saying about the amount of consensus and agreement most people have in this country. And I think we sort of know that when we walk down the street and talk to our neighbor, which I realize not everybody gets to do. I'm pretty lucky in the sense that I live in a neighborhood where I'll walk the dog and I actually know all my neighbors. And it's been like this. It's been this incredibly enriching, simple pleasure of life that especially in the during COVID and after was like, thank God I live in this little neighborhood, this dead end street, and I can walk down the street and just talk to James and talk to Cindy and talk to Ron and see how his dog is doing. And it grounds you in a way that our all rhetoric, no connectivity seems to just be hard on us. It's hard on us, like almost like not just emotionally, health wise. It feels like it's not great for us to be disembodied the way we are so often. The emotion is an interesting, challenging thing to deal with when trying to tackle hard subjects. How do you think about the role of emotion, and how did the classical rhetoric thinkers think about emotion? I know, like, so ethos, I'm sorry, Yeah, what am I getting it right? No,
Pathos.
pathos,
Right.
pathos. Um, yeah, how should I think about that? How should I think about when emotion is good and when I'm simply being manipulated and having my emotions get the best of me?
Aristotle wrote a lot about emotions. I mean, he listed them, as he tended to do, as if they were, plants. But the whole taxonomy of emotions. What's interesting is how our emotions have been changed, or rather, the manipulation of our emotions has been changed in recent times. One of the things that Aristotle wrote, and there's a lot of science that seems to confirm this, is that anger is one of the shortest emotions. You blow up, you get angry, you get over it pretty quickly.
Yeah.
There's the regret phase. You lose your temper, in other words. A lot of work has been done to keep that anger level up. Now, anxiety has increased greatly, and the Greeks wrote about anxiety a lot. And they had a lot of cures for anxiety. In fact, whole philosophies were behind this. Epicureanism essentially is a cure for anxiety, all stemming from Plato and Aristotle. Now, what social media does, and I think a lot of the problems that we've been talking about that social media causes have to do with this idea of attention. Now, it used to be that attention was not the most valuable commodity, right? I mean, expertise was, because in order to um, make money from, say, a book or a movie, you had to be good enough. You had to know something or be sufficiently entertaining or whatever to elevate yourself to that expensive process of producing a film or publishing a book. Now, the price of producing content that gets out there is almost zero. And so there's no need to be elevated to that level. Everybody can do it. So what gets valued instead? Attention, because there's so much content, obviously. It's so hard to get people's attention. And that attention itself becomes a commodity that people will pay to get. Now, what does that mean? It means that we are more and more distanced. You would think that this would make us closer to the producers of content, right? And the closer people feel to those producers, the more influenced they are by them. That's clear. You do a great podcast, people will follow you more than they follow actually the content itself. They will love what you're doing. Now, but at the same time, for the most part, when you're seeing nothing but a churn of content from everybody, you don't have Walter Cronkite telling you the news anymore, the old-time newscaster.
Right.
You now have thousands of people telling you the news. That's a churn, and it causes a distance. And that's one of the most important things we haven't talked about in terms of rhetoric, is this ability to make people feel close to one another. Now we're really in the heart of emotions here, which is the whole oxytocin effect. How do you get people not just to trust you, but to love you? And the more they feel that particular emotion of closeness and wanting to please you, which the Greeks called philos or philos, this obligation we suddenly feel toward each other, that we want to follow you and please you and do the right things for you. I actually creep out students. I talk with classes during the school year, several weeks out of the year, if they adopt my book. And it's getting creepier the older I get. I turn 70 next month, and I'm talking
You
to.
look great for 70, my man.
Oh, I was fishing for a compliment, John. Thank you. When I lean into my camera in my writer's cabin I speak out of, and I give them one last thing. I say, when you feel nervous about speaking to people who aren't like you, who may not look like you, may not be the same age, guess what? I'm as different from you as anybody in the room, because I'm a privileged old white guy talking to you and telling you about ancient dead white guys. The last thing I tell clients before they go into a room, and I say this to students, is Marcus Tullius Cicero said the eyes were the windows to the soul. Show a loving soul. Before you walk in a room, tell yourself, I'm going to love these people. And believe it or not, there is a good deal of research that shows there is amazing interaction if people actually intentionally try to feel the love. And I know when I talk to students, they think I've just chewed some interesting gummy or something. And it sounds weird when I say it now after talking about the ancient Greeks and Romans. But you know what? They talked about it too. And the term agape was used by all the Greeks and Romans. There's a reason that Jesus talked about it so much. And that's
Yeah,
that feeling of expressed love.
yeah, it's a very interesting thing how um I don't know how much of this translates through screens, because we're so subtle in the things we pick up in person. Now, and I know some of it translates through screens, because one example, I've got a visual effects background, and there's this term called the uncanny valley. So,
Yeah.
computer generated
Yeah.
human images, they can live in this world where it, on paper, or like, just as a quick glance, or when it's not moving, it can look believable, but then there's something off. And it's very disconcerting when you're in the uncanny valley, where you're almost human, but you're not. And we are just so subtle in the way we perceive things, that we don't even know what we're putting through our eyes. Like who even knows exactly what it is, the mechanism that leads from telling yourself, before I give this talk, okay, I love everyone in that room, and making that a mantra, and then going out, and that's somehow different. I've read that I just came across this recently, that there has been some studies around smiling, that actually, if you smile, you will feel happier. It's a kind of fake it till you make it sort of effect.
Yeah, I think there is. I mean, I wrote a book about self-persuasion where a certain kind of faking it works. Some doesn't, actually. I mean, if you're too aware of the faking part, it actually gets you into that uncanny valley. At the same time, one of the things that feeling the love for others and trying to express that, what that does is that increases this sense of philos, or obligation to others, in yourself. And one way to build trust with people, even over a screen, is to make a genuine, honest attempt to understand the other person, to see where they're coming from. And you can feel a certain joy in doing that. Now, that takes a different quality that's really important, that rhetoricians who invented the humanities back in the 13th century, 14th century, called liberality, which is this openness to others and openness to the strange. And what that means is, when you feel like, when you're willing to be able to love others, when you don't really understand them right away, what you're immediately feeling is an obligation to serve them. And one way to serve them is to understand what their needs and wants are. It's also a highly manipulative thing to do, because obviously if you show your understanding of what they truly need, you can bring them around to what your choice is all along. There is this, it's a complicated thing, this rhetoric. All that being said, expressing the love does cause a reaction in others. But at the same time, it does cause reaction in you, much like smiling changes your mood.
I couldn't help but hear Bill Clinton's voice in the back of my head from the 90s, saying like, "Ah, feel your pain." That's where does empathy, how do you even think about what empathy is, and what role does it play in rhetoric? Because it feels like we live in an age of empathy, and an age of, I want to demonstrate that I understand where you're coming from.
He said that so well. That drives me nuts. And I'll tell you why. Because, there's sympathy and there's empathy. And I think we confuse the two terms for reasons beyond my word nerdiness. Sympathy is when you actually truly feel the emotions of others, and that could be destructive. Like you see, or it can just be sorrowful. You see a little kid seeing another kid cry, and that kid will cry. That's sympathy. Empathy is understanding the emotions of others and knowing what to do about it. And we all got confused about that through Star Trek, because who's the character who was the empath?
Diana Troy, the empath.
What a babe. Anyway, she would.
She was a babe.
She was. And yet she almost had this illness where she, like, all of a sudden she's feeling their emotions.
Oh, yeah. They'd encounter some alien. It looks like a jellyfish. And you'd see her like grasping her, like, it's in pain. I'm feeling its pain. Literally, it was like a Bill Clinton speech every time they'd encounter some Kardashian or something. Or what was it, the Kardashians? Yeah. I think that's what they were called. The show has forever changed my understanding of the name. Anyway, I'm going down a trekker rabbit hole here.
Yeah, I feel your pain.
Okay. So sympathy is the feelings. Define these again for me, because actually when you were describing what you were calling sympathy, I was thinking, wait, isn't that empathy? So for everyone, but especially me, define these two terms in terms of how they're also different from each other.
Okay, if people learn nothing else from this episode, they'll be able to annoy their friends with this distinction. Diana Troy was a sympath, not an empath. A sympath is the person who feels what others feel, who shares those feelings. An empath is someone who understands those feelings. And you said they express their understanding. That's an empath, right? You're not saying, so Bill Clinton was not feeling their pain. He was understanding their pain and then expressing it in a way that convinced them that he felt them. That's a rhetorical strategy. Empathy is rhetorical. And it's good. It's a good thing. Being empathetic to others means understanding their suffering, whatever it is. And then, because you're not actually sharing those emotions, you're in a state where maybe you're better than they are at doing something about it. You can change their mood or solve their problem or lead people to a higher place, or at least sort of be with them in the room. That's a kind act. But if you're crying because they're crying, I don't understand why you would have an officer on the Enterprise, getting sick over jellyfish. I mean, this is why it kind of drives me crazy when people truly don't understand the deeper meanings of terms. We can go all the way back to Plato. Socrates, the reason why he was condemned to death was because he drove everybody crazy asking about the meaning of words all the time, which is a very annoying thing to do. And I am a lesser Socrates in that respect. I annoy people with this. But the importance of knowing the distinction of words, I think, allows us to avoid being overly manipulated by people's use of them. So when people say, I'm a very empathetic person, that's a really manipulative rhetorical thing to say. You're expressing something that you want, a value that you want them to share. And people ought to be able to say, oh, okay, I get it. It doesn't mean you're going to cry when I do. It means that you're understanding me to the point where you're either going to manipulate me or help solve my problem here. See what I'm doing there? I mean, that's the difference between empathy and sympathy, for what it's worth.
One of the things that that is interesting about some really big topics and the way they get handled is that there's in your book, and you've already mentioned it in our conversation, that when we want to be persuasive, the best place to get the listener or our audience is a state of comfort. And what's so interesting about that, is so much of what is considered to be the most important kind of rhetoric, in this case, I'll use the climate change crisis rhetoric as an example, is doing the opposite. And I happen to not be in the camp that thinks climate change is a crisis. I think it's something that's manageable, and that the crisis people have other stuff they're trying to do. We might disagree on that. But it doesn't seem like their strategy is very good from a rhetoric perspective, because it seems like it is almost always designed to make people uncomfortable. And help me understand what the role of sort of comfort is in being persuadable, and where does that go right and wrong? And let's use the climate change rhetoric as an example. Greta Thunberg lecturing us all about the pending disaster. I mean, let's assume she's actually correct or whatever. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what side of this you're on, just from a rhetoric perspective.
Well, so we have to go in a couple of different rhetorical directions here. If you're talking particularly about Greta Thunberg, she is speaking to an audience that's not you and me, and hugely effective. The fact is, if you look at people under 20, they think climate change is a huge crisis, and she's partly responsible for that. Good for her. She is creating a political movement of people who will be voting a few years from now. So she's accomplishing what she wants. That's rhetorically effective. Now, there's another stream of how people talk about climate change, where they are talking about a brighter future. And that was, for a while, pretty effective. You did have the very badly named Green New Deal, where, a lot of stuff could have been built if it had been done effectively and in a greater hurry than it was. With the idea that, okay, we're going to be the leaders in an economic change that's going to happen whether you want it or not. That's not crisis talk, and a lot of the moderate Democrats were talking along those lines and getting bills passed on a bipartisan basis. The problem was, I think, that climate change became a values issue. And this is where I think where you're going in terms of causing anxiety. I think it's more a tribal division. I'll tell you who screwed up climate change from the get-go was Al Gore, because he portrayed climate change as a value. And
for sure.
Before that, a majority of Republicans thought climate change was a problem and that it was caused by humans. So, a huge majority of Republicans, before Al Gore stepped up, and it was, of course, he was representing a political party, which was a problem to begin with. But more than that, is he called it a values issue. And that immediately divided people, because there are a lot of people who said, I don't know if climate change is that big a problem. I'm not sure that simply fighting CO2 is the solution in any case. That is a reasonable, logical opinion, one I disagree with. But absolutely, we could have a great conversation about that, and maybe talk a little bit more about the importance of resilience instead of just talking about CO2, and leading to a better place, and maybe things that could get built to beat China or whatever. The problem is, if you call it a value, you're excluding anybody who hasn't yet formed an opinion. You're dividing people tribally. You're in that realm of present tense demonstrative rhetoric instead of deliberative rhetoric that says, okay, what exactly is the problem and how are we going to fix it?
Yeah, it's very interesting about the way this type of rhetoric takes place, in that are there different do you think there's different sort of psychological profiles that tend to drive people towards certain styles of rhetoric? Because it does seem like and I would put the climate crisis crowd in this position, maybe uncharitably, but that there's a sort of extreme anxiety that you just comes across, and it seems like it correlates with some other attributes that strike me as having kind of deep psychological underpinnings. It's not merely I'm choosing to try to make an argument in a way that'll achieve an objective. It's I am a kind of person, or I'm in a kind of state that leads me to make my argument in a certain way. And what have you observed about sort of this phenomenon? Do people make different kinds of arguments in different states of mind? Maybe this is not a coherent question, but...
Well, I mean, what I'm hearing from you is that, first of all, is there a kind of personality that tends to argue demonstratively, creating this sort of value. On the other hand, I mean, frankly, I started covering climate change in 1980. When I was working at a forestry journal early in my career as a reporter in Washington. And that was one of my gigs. And I was invited to a CO2 conference. It's like, why would I care about the bubbles in Coke? I mean, what's that got to do with anything? I had no idea. And I kept getting more and more like journals. I had to read journals as part of my job. And I kept seeing more and more stuff about the greenhouse effect. How bizarre. This is weird. That same thing that causes bubbles in Coke is somehow warming the planet. Is crazy. And yet, more and more of the science came in. Now, I began to see, the way I think is maybe too spectrumy this way, in that, like, I'm not an empath. I don't feel that emotion about that. I once actually wrote a climate change story for a magazine that lost thousands of readers after I published it. And the way I portrayed it was, I said, we're going to lead you on a global climate change tour where we're going to enjoy climate change. We're going to look at all the landscapes that have been made cooler, and you can be the first to go there to see this changed landscape. And I took my 13-year-old son to Alaska, where we saw a wilderness that no one had entered since all kinds of things had happened caused by climate change. All right, so I said in the story, if my son and I saw an asteroid plummeting toward Earth, we would get up on the roof and watch it. But there is a kind of personality, and I think it's probably a more legitimate one, frankly, who would say, there's an asteroid coming. They're going to shout that. You're not going to say, let's see, how am I going to make people understand there's an asteroid and that maybe we need to start digging holes in a hurry, or whatever you do for an asteroid. There are a lot of people who legitimately believe that the future is going to be a horror because of climate change. Mm-hmm. I don't entirely agree with that, and I think it's bad rhetoric, in part because we should be doing things. And one of them is we should be practicing resilience a whole lot more. The fact is, we are seeing patterns that we can't deny. Miami is flooding more. There's no question about that. If you're going to say this is caused by CO2 and we have to do something about CO2, it's not going to solve the flooding in Miami. So I think that there's a series of conversations that have to be made with reasonable people like you, who may not be so upset about CO2, but want to do something about flooding cities, or the fact that crop resilience is going to be a factor, and we need to do something about that too, and so on.
You are touching on something. I'm looking down. I want to scroll through my notes, because there's in one of your later chapters, you talk about a range of fallacies, and I thought this was some of the most. There's so much useful in your book and in this conversation, but you're touching on something that was one of the fallacy types, which was the disconnection between the proof and the conclusion.
Yeah,
the idea that, okay, let's assume for a moment that the climate is changing in a way that's going to have costs as well as benefits, but there will be costs. The leap from that recognition to we should ban all cars, or we should do whatever that next conclusion is, that tends to be the biggest place where I go I just find so much of what gets said following that, in the climate issue in particular, as being just uncredible. Like, just for example, and I'm staying on this issue mostly because not to make a debate about climate change in our conversation so much as it's maybe the biggest example of a wide range of rhetoric that's very charged and very broad, and also kind of abstract in our public discourse. So let's dig into these fallacies, because I think that's one of them. What are the fallacies that we should look out for as citizens, as listeners of rhetoric, to help us know when someone has sort of set a little bit of a trap for our mind? Like, if you're worried about this, therefore that. There's this, I think it was from a British TV show, that in the sequence was, We need to do something. This is something. We need to do this.
What was it? Harry Truman said something like that. He said, it's important to make a decision, any decision.
Yeah, right. It's like, wait, something happened there that it sounded, you lulled me into a trap. So walk me through, and our listeners and viewers through, some of the different fallacies that get employed in rhetoric.
Well, I'm so glad that you brought up the proof and conclusion thing, because you know what's worse than correcting someone's grammar? Pointing out their fallacies. Now, if you can name them, good, extra points for you. They're still going to hate you. So a lot of fallacies do come up with these two beats, and they have to do with a piece of Aristotelian logical rhetoric, deductive rhetoric that he called the enthymeme. And if we can get in the weeds a little bit here.
Yeah, we have the time. So
okay, thank God. The proof and conclusion have to do with the enthymeme, which is that if you hear anybody say, because this, therefore that, or it's doing this, so we should do this. If you say, looks like rain, let's bring an umbrella, that's an enthymeme. Now, Aristotle sensibly shortened that from the extremely annoying syllogism. All men are mortal, Socrates is immortal, therefore Socrates is a man. Isn't that amazing? Great logic. Well, so he shortened that to say, Socrates is going to die someday because all men die. That's an enthymeme. Now, when you screw up either looks like rain or we should bring an umbrella, you're committing a fallacy of one sort or another. So if I say, it's never rained here, we don't need an umbrella. First of all, what's your proof? Has it really never rained here? That you've got to ask that. And then on the other hand, why shouldn't we bring an umbrella? Like, what are the costs of bringing that umbrella? That sounds a lot like your climate change question, doesn't it? Like, in other words, okay, is the climate changing? Is the world climate truly changing? Well, a lot of people in America, unlike the rest of the world, are very much in denial of that. I mean, if I say there's a scientific consensus, I get nowhere, because what are scientists after all? But I do read scientific journals. And I've been looking at data. So I would say, my argument to you would be, okay, the proof isn't the problem here. The conclusion is going to be interesting. Because
I would agree with that. The conclusion in this case is a far bigger source of problems than the proof, the assertion.
Yeah.
Sure.
Now, there are other kinds of fallacies that still kind of are proof and conclusion. For example, I said to my wife as we were driving to the airport this morning, when she accused me, I was resetting the climate stuff, speaking of climate, on the car. And veered slightly on a rural road with no damage to anybody. And she kind of freaked out, saying, let me set the climate here. Will you stop, taking your hands off the... And of course, I said to her, I have never had an accident. So you are with a perfectly safe driver. Now, I was deliberately committing a fallacy, the fallacy of antecedent, as it's called, where, first of all, what was my proof? I've never had an accident. Not literally true. But more important, the conclusion there, does that mean it would never happen? That's where the conclusion really goes off the rails, as the car really almost did. So now, in terms of other kinds of...
Past performance is not a guarantee of future performance.
Exactly. Now, another fallacy. A doctor says to you, we didn't find anything, there's nothing wrong with you. That is a fallacy called ad ignorantium, meaning we don't know it, therefore it doesn't exist. So, now if the tests were negative and you don't need another test and the doctor convinces you you don't, the doctor is using an ethical argument, not a logical one, because, you can always have more tests. The question is, do you trust the doctor? So, but if the doctor says, not the tests were negative, but we didn't find anything, that's a clue to ask some questions. What do you mean you didn't find anything? What were you looking for? Were you looking for the right things? You know, and so does it, the fact that you didn't find anything logically does not mean there's nothing wrong with me. And for one thing, my stomach still hurts. Like, you have not found a solution. You've only found a lack of information. Okay, that's the ignoradium argument. There's a similar argument that I call the Chanticleer effect, but I shouldn't say that anymore because nobody knows who Chanticleer was. Chanticleer was this ancient, French, I guess, fable that when the rooster crowed, he thought he was making the sun come up. It's like, you know, a baby cries and makes his mother come. Actually, that's true. But it's also, you know, so that's the ad hoc propter, ad hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy.
Yes.
You know, something happened, therefore it caused it. And you see that all the time.
This is a big one. This is the correlation versus causation. Like, does the clock striking 8 in Grand Central Station cause people to flood out of the trains, or is it that they arrive at 8 and flood out, and because it's scheduled and the clock's not causing it, it's the other way around?
Exactly. And you could say, if you're someone who doesn't want to deal with climate change, you can say, okay, the streets are flooding in Miami. That doesn't mean that climate change caused it. Like, yes, the global temperatures have risen. What does that have to do with flooding? You'd better make a good connection here, and it's very hard to do.
Yeah. Oh, and I think on that case in particular, I think there's quite a bit of debate about whether there's actually even been any real correlation between recent CO2 and extreme weather events. The extreme weather event argument seems to be more rhetorical than data driven.
Well, you know, and this is not to push back in an argument in any way, but my favorite thing to do is to say, you know what, I really, I have a good news, bad news situation. I'm approaching 70. I may turn 80 and feel terrible. But on the other hand, 10 years from now, I'll be right. There will be floods everywhere, mass confusion. And I will have the satisfaction of knowing I was right. Because, you know, if we're talking about something that's a trend, the greatest way to win an argument, back to Kairos, the art of opportunity or timing, it's like, okay, just wait.
Yeah. The broken clock is right twice a day.
Well, right, and at a clock that never works, I will prove to you that next day is still not working.
So yeah, what other? You had 7 sins that were sort of clusters of fallacies. Can you take us through them? I've got them in front of me, and if you need a little cheat
you're
sheet.
gonna. I mean, I haven't read the book in years. You're gonna have to help me here.
Okay, we'll do a quick rapid fire here on the 7 sins of rhetoric as we start to come to the end of our conversation. The first one was the false comparison. So what is that all about?
Well, it's closely related to the unit fallacy, which is a very common fallacy. Last year, I was in London, and I went to a Nando's, peri peri chicken, great place. And I paid only £8 for my meal. And only when I came home did I realize that a pound is 30% higher, and even higher now against the dollar than it was. And I didn't pay attention. Pounds, dollars are pretty much the same thing. It's the apples and oranges fallacy. For my latest book, I attempted to become the first person over 50 to run his age up a particular mountain that Olympians, you know, test their VO2 max on. Running my age up a mountain meant getting to the top in fewer minutes than I was older than in years. Now, this is something only a dozen people had ever done it. It's a real thing, but it's also committing a fallacy of comparison, because minutes to the top has nothing to do with the years old. And I was arguing it actually is a better indication of my youth than how old I am in years. All right, but when you see that fallacy often when people are making false comparisons between things, like when people compare how different cultures behave, for instance, the fact that, you know, people eat the wrong foods or behave the wrong ways. They're comparing that with what they think is a universal good of dinner time, or, you know, ways to pray in church or whatever. That's actually a fallacious comparison that fails you to get to the higher truth of how people behave.
Is this also sort of often called like a category error, that you're trying to make a comparison between two different types of things that really aren't similar in the ways you're asserting?
Oh God, you should see the way my wife puts things away in the kitchen. I mean, it makes absolutely no sense to me. And when she explains it, actually, it makes perfect sense in her mind. So she'll put things together that are the same color, when I kind of think in a kitchen, they should serve particular purposes. That's a category.
We have the same exact situation going in my house.
That's
all these spoons are red, so this is why they're together. Okay.
Category fallacy right there.
All right. Next up, the bad example, or misinterpreting the evidence. What is this? What is this sin all about?
Oh my gosh, I won't name her, but I have a relative who, and this is a case where a single unit is used to interpret everything. I have a brilliant relative who graduated from Harvard in 3 years, but she started out as a chemistry major, and she got a B on one exam and decided she would be terrible at chemistry. That is that fallacy. So you take a single datum, you know, single dot on a graph, and you use it to blow everything up. An example of that, just to tease you a little bit about climate change, there was a senator from Idaho who proved there was no climate change by throwing a snowball in the Senate House.
I remember this.
That's committing that very fallacy. Like, look, snowball, therefore no climate change. They had taken one piece of evidence to interpret much more broadly.
Would cherry picking be sort of an example or a common phrase to point out where this fallacy might be getting applied? Oh, you're just cherry picking the data?
Yeah, absolutely. That's pointing out a fallacy when you say that.
Okay, next up, the ignorance as proof, which we actually talked about. Sort of the lack of evidence.
The doctor fallacy, yeah.
Yeah, so we talked about that. Tautology, begging the question. So what is that? And help me sniff it out. Help my viewers sniff out tautologies.
I'm really good at politics. That's why I'm going into politics. That's you're basically, your proof and your conclusion are identical. That's really what a tautology is. Why it's called begging the question. I actually think that when people misuse the term begging the question, that should be misused. Like, the begging the question means, you know, you didn't ask the right question yet. And that's not technically what that means, but I think it should be. Am I making sense? So in other words, we shouldn't say begging the question for tautology. We should call it a tautology, which is basically the proof and conclusion are the same thing.
Yeah, it's sort of I think of it always as circular logic, that you've sort of smuggled in your answer to your question.
Yes. Yeah. And it happens all the time. And I have to say, one of the worst culprits is Trump. He does it all the time. You know,
How so?
I'm a great businessman. That's why I'm good at business.
It's his weaving. It's the weaving. It's the weaving. He does do this. He's not efficient with his language. Although I guess in a way it serves him in that it's repetition, which itself is a good teaching tool, even if it's fallacious.
Yes. And you know what? I mean, back to the period, he actually speaks in what some rhetoricians call the comedic style, where it's like Bob Hope. You set up the joke, punchline, new joke, punchline, not, you know, disconnected thoughts. But, you know, when I measured them, most of when he's delivering these punchy speeches, less now, I think he's slowing down, but his periods were 12 to 13 seconds.
Oh, how about that?
Yeah.
It's okay. Next up, the false choice. And this one was interesting. So, many questions being bundled together. That was one note I have. So what is the false choice fallacy?
Well, it's the classic, when did you stop beating your wife? But also, push polls are like this. Would you rather cause climate disaster or improve the economy? I mean, in other words, what you're basically saying is you're making it impossible. You're offering two choices when there's actually a third. That's the false choice fallacy. We could either go to the beach or go to the lake. There's a third choice: stay home.
Right. Or many, many more choices.
Many more.
This is actually a really important one because one of the things that we hear all the time in our public discourse is, frankly, public opinion is X. And I've seen an example where, for example, universal health care, whatever that's supposed to mean. 80% of the public believes that we should have universal health care. And this is one of these push-pull questions where if you include any degree of cost,
yes,
the number goes from 80% to 20%.
Yes.
It's like, do you support universal health care? 80% say yes. Do you support universal health care if it will add an additional $200 to your costs? No.
Yes, that's absolutely true. And a more egregious fallacy would be in a push poll that says, would you rather have universal health care or 20% of the population dying? That's,
Right.
that's a false choice.
Yeah. That's really this one really does come. I feel like this one comes up a lot in argumentation in politics, where we are confronted with false choices all the time.
The time.
It is the thing I want you to choose, or catastrophe, or or something that you clearly think would make you a bad person if you had to choose it.
Yeah, and now also that leads to a principle that the Greeks were pretty good at avoiding, at least the smart ones, which is they come up. Aristotle came up with the principle of mediocrity, which is a bad word now, but mediocrity to him was the golden mean, the middle choice, and he made the point that in politics the middle choice is often excluded. And we see that today in politics. And the idea, I think we should get back to mediocrity. We should have a mediocrity, a rule by the middle. And he actually thought that's what deliberative rhetoric would achieve. He would say that a soldier should be in between foolhardy and cowardly. That would be a good soldier, the one who would duck from the spears but wouldn't run away. And in politics, that could solve a lot of problems in the middle.
I think of a recent conversation I had with somebody who's a pretty influential voice in sort of conservative sort of politics. And I was surprised because he's a big supporter of Trump. And he said, with regard to immigration, he's like, the big mistake they made is they should have announced essentially something like an amnesty for people who've been here for more than 5 years and haven't committed any crimes and aren't on the government dole. He kind of laid out a middle way that that struck me as eminently reasonable, and it's not been on the table, and it hasn't. But these kinds of middle ways that would be better than where we are now do seem to be few and far between. And I don't know. I do wonder: is that just a feeling? Or is it truly something that has changed in our politics and in our discourse?
Well,
how do you feel about that? You've been around the block longer than me. Has this really changed? You've been living in this political land in DC. You've seen this stuff.
Yeah, in politics, it's definitely changed. And in rhetoric, you'd call that a situation problem. Like, are you setting up a situation where an argument is impossible? And that situation is easy districts. I mean, the fact is, if you get a district that is consistently blue or red, then if you stray toward the middle, you're going to get primaried. So bipartisanship is a liability, not an asset, to a majority of members of Congress. Very difficult to pass bipartisan bills. Now, there was actually a bipartisan bill that might have passed that dealt with immigration much along the lines that your friend mentioned. And that was shut down before the election because Trump was opposed to it. Now, he wanted that issue in order to run on it, which is another situation problem because the thing is, if you, and this has happened repeatedly on both sides of the aisle, where the problem itself, the longer it's sustained, enhances your political standing. That problem has to exist in order for you to run against it, in other words. So compromise used to be highly valued in politics by the politicians. I don't know that it was enjoyed that much by the public. Because, I mean, come on, reading a news story about a compromise is boring. That being said, and you know, the thing is also, and I think there is a solution to this. I don't know what to do about, you know, gerrymandering. That is a fix that lies beyond rhetoric. A lot of rhetoric can argue about it and maybe move the needle a little bit. I don't think people understand what gerrymandering is and how bad it could be. That being said, one solution to this is what I think I mentioned earlier. And I am the only person saying this in the world, so trust me, I'm right. A hyperbolic political language can actually be useful. I mentioned Mamdani. I find it so hard to pronounce his name. And Trump did the same thing, which is like promise the moon. People won't care whether it's on the left or the right. Promise it. Promise a glorious future where everybody is healthier than they've ever been. And then say specifically what you're going to promise to get them there. Promise them the fastest trains in the world between San Francisco and LA that will be paid for by Mexico or whatever. Make big promises. And if you do it in a way that's more believable than I put it, people are going to say, he'll never get there, but maybe he'll get 20%. And that's a big improvement over where we are right now. One of the most important things that you can talk about to gain bipartisan standing in Congress is to make a huge, big, exaggerated, impossible promise to build houses and say, we're going to have 20 million more houses or whatever number you come up with. And the way we're going to get there is, you know, scientific zoning, make it complicated enough that people don't know what you're talking about, but then say, and the way we're going to pay for that is this, and come up with something that's never going to happen. You're going to end up with and is that cynical? Absolutely. And it's not something I would say aloud as a politician, but thank God I'm not. What that ends up doing is you will get people starting to find a solution because Americans are going to say, yeah, thumbs up. You know, left, right, I don't care. You know, make sure that we're pushing out the bad immigrants, but we can do that. And you know, not 30 million or whatever the number is, but you know, enough of them. And then on the other hand, build houses. I think you'll see Congress, both sides voting for it, and they won't get primaried for it.
I think I missed the part where this makes the world better.
Well, more houses.
Hyperbole.
Well, you know, the reason I mentioned that is so sometimes the dark art of rhetoric has to come in to solve problems, sometimes in a dark way. And the fact is, bipartisanship has become impossible. There is one way out, which exploits the fact that Americans aren't as divided right and left as people think. And one way to do that is to make promises that everybody would be stupid for not wanting. Like, do you want to see people lying on the sidewalks? I'll solve that in 5 years. 1 year. Tomorrow.
Yeah. Interesting. That's an interesting thought. It's a counterintuitive kind of optimism you've laid out here.
Nice put. That's a nice way to put it, because what that gets back to is an extreme form of deliberative rhetoric, affecting the future by making choices. And so Aristotle did point this out. He said, if you want to convince someone of an action, make it glorious. make it a big promise, and then make it seem easy. He said that, I didn't. We're talking Aristotle here. This is me just being crazy.
As we wrap things up, in everything we've been talking about, there is this question. And the question is, aren't you just trying to manipulate? You just called it the dark arts. Throughout our conversation, there is this, we pointed to it many times, the sense in which the tools of rhetoric are like a Faustian bargain. They're like a deal with the devil. How do you think about that? How do you think about that as someone who celebrates rhetoric and has put forward a guide to be a better, one could say, a better manipulator? What's the moral quandary there? How do you think about it?
I'm so glad you asked that. And I'm encouraged by the fact that more and younger students are asking me that very question. It used to be just law students. Now it's, I get high school students, junior high, middle school students even asking it now. I think it's really important, and it's something that should be top of mind for anybody who learns the skill. So I have really sort of a bifurcated answer here. One is that I think it's really important to understand the tools of manipulation to avoid being manipulated. We talked about inoculation against this kind of, disease of rhetoric. But even more important than that, I think that I'm honest when I say it's a tool of manipulation. There was a guy from North Africa, Roman citizen named Quintilian, who said that an orator is a good man speaking well. Now, Sarah Bakewell is a wonderful writer and deeply thoughtful person, said what that means is that rhetoric, when it's at its best, brings people together to make solutions in common. And that's a goodness that comes out of that. I'm way more cynical than that. But what it does mean is that if you personally think you are a good person and that is important to you, the way you practice rhetoric will be ethical. You are learning an art that can hurt people, literally has killed millions of people. Hitler was a brilliant rhetorician. It's up to you to use it well. And I think that's the moral to the whole story of rhetoric. And when you do use it well, you can change people and bring them to a better place.
Yay, I ask this of every guest. And in many ways, you've probably just delivered the answer in a beautiful period. This show is called Dad Saves America because I believe, and I think a lot of us here at our organization believe, that it's a role we play as men that's heroic, that ripples out from our family to the community to the country. How do you think about your role in the American story?
Oh, wow. I thought you were going to ask me about my role as a dad. That would be deeply embarrassing. So thank you.
You can go to dad if you want, but it can be any other place.
Well, I mean, it sounds cheesy when I say this, so I'm almost embarrassed to say it. I feel as if this is my personal purpose. I had a need to understand the power of words as a child. And my ability to share that power and what I know about it, which I learn more every day about, I think is my way of bringing hope to people who, first of all, feel they don't have a voice. And I think an important role for a dad is to empower other people to speak at the dinner table or, I think there's, just getting back to dadhood here, it is so important to laugh at your kids' jokes. that does so much.
Because they're not going to laugh at ours. They're not going to laugh at ours.
You can pretend not to laugh, but then they know, as long as you appreciate their humor. And I think that if you talk about things rippling out, your ability to make other people better, in part by giving them the right kind of voices and encouraging the voices that bring others to a good place. When I share rhetoric with these high school classes over Zoom, I reach one person at a time. And in fact, I even say so at the beginning. I'm only going to reach one of you, the one who's going to save the world. I'm rooting for you. I'll vote for you someday, but it's only you. I don't know who it is. Share with me. Tell me you're the one who's going to save us all if you went to it. Of course, every kid is thinking, I may be the one. So it's a rhetorical, manipulative tactic. At the same time, almost miraculously, in these students' AP language classes, I see a light bulb go over one kid's head every time. And I think that's why I do what I do. That kid is going to go on, and that's going to mean something to him. And that kid is going to learn more and share it and start thinking there's a responsibility to the power of words.
Hey, Heinrichs, thanks for being on Dad Saves America. This was a really fun conversation.
It was for me. Thank you.